There's a show a while back called The Americans that had Matthew Rhys in it and, who played the lady? Carrie Russell? I think, yeah, the gal who had the teeny tiny little cameo as girl in helmet, mild love interest of Poe Dameron in the regrettable and forgettable Star Wars sequels. But The Americans is good. Is a show about the 1980s and some Russian spies who have to pose as a married couple. I guess they are technically married, and they're operating under the nose of the American government and during the Reagan years. And it's troubling and it's effective. And one of the things that is the most difficult to watch about it is the way they use people up. I guess they call these people assets who they flip to their ideology or who they manipulate with love or promises of money or whatever. It's just deplorable long-term playing somebody to get them to do something that the spies themselves are not in a position to do. And when it's over and that person comes back and is like, hey, I did the thing, I'll see a Red Lobster shooter. They're like, no, I don't care. And they just blow the person off and leave them for dead. And it's very, very painful to watch. Likewise, in Matthew 27, or really through the last few chapters that we've been looking at in Matthew, we're getting a similar situation here. You've got people who want Jesus dead, but they're not in a position to do anything about it. Because, well, we discover really early on when Jesus makes his way into Jerusalem that they do not have, that is, the enemies of Jesus, do not have the public support to just go out and arrest him or bust him or make a public example of him. They're going to have to find a clever way to make it go without it looking like they were totally responsible and making it look like Jesus is the one who condemned himself. So they hatch this elaborate plan, but they're going to need an inside man. Of course, as you know from like just being a human who's alive and aware of the stories that shape our culture. And also, as you know, from being a part of this conversation, Judas is the stooge. He's the guy who they pick. He's the weak link. He's the one who's frail enough, weak enough, manipulatable enough, insecure enough, whatever it might be, that they can get to him, that they can flip him, turn him into an asset. And when the time comes to make the big play, the religious leadership, the enemies of Jesus, are only going to get one crack at it. They got to make sure they're arresting the right guy. There's no photographs or paintings of Jesus. So if you play your hand and you botch it, now you're really in trouble. So Judas helps him out by identifying Jesus properly and by letting them know where and when they could find him that would be out of the public eye so that they could initiate things against him, gain the upper hand, and have him killed. Well, like so many assets in the Americans or in history, once Judas has served his purpose, he's no longer of any value to the religious leaders whatsoever. They don't love him. They don't care about him. They used him up and disposed of him. And look, before I read this passage again that we're looking at today in Matthew 27, I know it sounds like I'm being all empathetic to the guy who sold out Jesus and had him killed, but I am. Because even though he was super wrong, it demonstrates the pure evil, not of the Jewish people, but of these religious leaders. These religious leaders represent a through line of the tradition that was opposed to God at every turn while wearing godly outfits and priestly robes the whole time. They represent a through line tradition of people who posed as agents of the kingdom but didn't give a rip about the kingdom at all, and instead not only opposed but killed the prophets God sent, and now are in the process of killing God's own son, who he sent. That is how the text holds it out. So hear me on this. I'm not describing a wholesale condemnation of the Jews, nor is the Bible doing that, but these particular Jewish people who are responsible for the spiritual leadership of the people. The Bible, Jesus himself, by his own words, he's saying, you guys are on the hook. Peter says it in Acts chapter 4. You guys, these leaders are on the hook. And we see these guys using all kinds of language about just the moral importance of what it is they need to do for the good of people and the good of others. But when it comes to do they actually care about people? Well, we get some behind-the-scenes looks in passages like this. When Judas, who'd betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. I've sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. We talked yesterday about how the timeline here is probably not chronological, almost certainly not chronological. So I don't know how far after the fact this is that Judas is dealing with this, but we know it's before the day of Pentecost described in Acts chapter 2 because Matthias had been selected to replace Judas, and it looks like Judas is already dead at that point. We've also discussed how this Judas bit is happening out of sequence so that it can be compared to the consequences of Peter's failure. One is apostateness. One is a temporary failure that demonstrates that nobody is righteous. Not even one. All sin and fall short of the glory of God. Even blessed St. Peter couldn't get this right on his own, but what Judas did is different than what Peter did. And Peter, you come away from the book of Matthew imagining could be restored. Back to the passage we're looking at. So enough time has passed that things have unfolded, and Judas is like, whoa, what happened? That's too much. Now, you might be thinking, like, whoa, what did Judas expect here, really? Did he think he would turn Jesus over to the religious leaders and they'd have a stern chit-chat with him? I don't know, like maybe you could craft some elaborate defense where it's like, no, Judas just knew that Jesus' thing wasn't going to work out, and Judas was doing this for Jesus' own good because he knew that Jesus couldn't help himself, and in the same way that Jesus' family showed up to try to extract him from running afoul of the law way back there up in Galilee when he was teaching, and then Jesus went on to say, like, who are my brothers and mothers and sisters? Like, it's the people who do the will of my Father. You know, maybe it was the same impulse that prompted Judas to want to do this. He's just trying to help a brother out and get him mild consequences instead of the big consequences, but then it results in the big consequences, and Judas freaks out. He's like, oh no, what have I done? Maybe. The text seems to nod more toward he was just doing pure evil with language like, then Satan entered him. What the text doesn't give us, if we accept the idea that Judas is just doing pure evil and Satan entered him and motivated that pure evil, what the text doesn't give us is when Satan exited him. Had that happened by this point? Was that some sort of temporary spiritual state in which Judas found himself? And now the scales have fallen off of the eyes and he realizes what's happened and he is no longer under that profound, intimate influence of Satan, Prince of Darkness himself? Yeah, it might be that. It might just be a situation that Judas now looks at and is like, whoa, what have I participated in? What have I done? Obviously, we can only speculate. I don't know how he got to this point of despair exactly, but point of despair it is. So he goes and he says stuff to the priests about like, hey, look what I've done. And in a tragic turn of events, this reminds me of a passage from another gospel. And I'm looking at the clock here and thinking, yes, I am going to chase down this spontaneous little connection that is coming to mind as we speak, and I suppose I'm just going to have to accept that we're going to have to break up this conversation about Judas into a few days. But think about this. Judas comes and he's like, I've sinned for I've betrayed innocent blood. Does it remind you of something? Because it reminds me of Luke 15. It reminds me of the story that the prodigal son comes back with. You remember this one? It's a parable of Jesus. It doesn't come up in Matthew, but it is in Luke. It's one of the most famous ever. It's about the kid who rejects his dad's fatherhood and is like, I can't even wait for you to die. I want my inheritance now. And then he takes the inheritance and he goes and he runs off and he lives in squanderous, horrible living and he burns through all of his dad's money. And then the money's gone. His friends are gone. He's feeding pigs and he wishes he could eat the pig food. And then finally he's like, you know what? My servants live better than this. I'm going to go back and I'm going to beg my dad to receive me. And he works on this whole speech that he's going to do. And he's like, all right, he runs through it a couple of times like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm telling him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But then when he's still a long way off, the father who's just been waiting for his runaway kid to come back and come to his senses, sees his kid and he goes running to him with no concern for his own dignity. And the son's like, okay, all right, practice this. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. But the father's like, forget it. My son was dead. Now he's alive again. Put the robe on him. Let's have a great big feast. And of course, it's this beautiful story of the forgiveness and the redemption of God. Contrast it with what we get right here from the Sanhedrin. Judas, hat in his hand, probably having rehearsed a very similar speech, shows up and he's like, okay, I got this. This is the speech. I've sinned, for I betrayed innocent blood. But instead of them running to meet him in the temple and being like, Poor son, poor Judas, you made the difficult choice to come back into the fold, to come home to the truth of the Jewish religion as we practice it and preach it. Of course we will receive you back. Put a robe on this guy. You know what? Let's have a feast in honor of who you are and what you've done. Don't let that guilt get you down, my son. You are received and welcomed back. Nope. We don't get a prodigal dad situation here in a prodigal son story. What we get is something ruinous and tragic. They're not like the father of the prodigal son at all. They don't care. Not my problem. You are not my son. You are not of value to us. What you are is a burned asset. We have extracted from you the services we needed to extract. And they reply saying, what is that to us? That's your responsibility. And that's it. It's a sneaky contrast that requires us to jump a couple books over to Luke, but I think the contrast is there, and I think it's real. More on the sad fate of Judas next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. We'll do this again soon.